Welcome back to part 2 of our series on Napoleon Bonaparte. In our first video, we looked at the background of France before Napoleon came to power. Then we looked at the rise of Napoleon through the First Consul and things like the Napoleonic Code. Now, in this video, we'll look at his dominance, his different wars in the Continental System that he develops, and then we'll look at his eventual decline and fall from power. So first up, his dominance, the coalition wars in the Continental System. Okay, so the coalition wars are a series of 7 different wars waged by various military alliances known as the coalitions, basically versus France. It's all these different people versus France. And the first coalition actually happens during the French Revolution. So the first coalition forms as European monarchies, including Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and some others, unite to stop the spread of revolutionary ideas from France. And after initial defeats, the French revolutionary armies gain momentum, especially under young generals like Napoleon Bonaparte. And France eventually forces several members to make peace. And the war ends with France gaining significant territory, including the Austrian Netherlands and parts of Italy. In the second coalition, we have allies like Britain, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire reacting to French expansion during the Directory and then eventually Napoleon's campaign in Italy. The war sees mixed results. Russia withdraws early and France suffers defeats in Italy. However, Napoleon returns to France in 1799 and seizes power as first consul, and then leads successful campaigns in Italy where he gains new land in Tuscany. Okay, then there's the third coalition. So this one is Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, forming the third coalition in response to Napoleon declaring himself emperor and expanding his influence across Europe. Napoleon decisively defeats Austria and Russia, and it's one of his greatest victories. Austria is forced to cede a lot of territory to France. Meanwhile, the British Navy under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar, securing British naval dominance despite Napoleon's land victories. Also, this is, if you've ever been to London, this is where we get Trafalgar Square. It's built to commemorate them beating the French. Okay, now the fourth one. So Prussia, along with Russia, Britain, and other allies, forms the fourth coalition against France's growing dominance. Napoleon pretty quickly crushes Prussia and later defeats Russian forces. The war ends, and Russia agrees to cooperate with Napoleon, and Prussia loses half its territory. This marks the height of Napoleon's power in Europe. And one thing you should be noticing is that basically each one of these little coalition wars, Napoleon is gaining more and more land in Europe. He's taking up a good chunk of the continent at this point. And it's at this point that he decides Britain is really his true foe at this time. And his goal is to isolate Britain. And he creates what's called the Continental System. Basically, what he's trying to do is blockade Britain to stop all the ships coming to Britain and having Britain come to the continent. So he's trying to outlast them and make it where they can't get resources in. And part of this problem is eventually what leads to the United States declaring war on Britain in the War of 1812, which is like a whole nother thing. But all of these things kind of compound together. So you can see here from the picture, the area is barred from importing British goods. He basically just draws a big line all around Europe and is like, Britain, you can't come here and you can't ship anything here. Good luck. Which kind of leads us to our next point, the defeat and decline of Napoleon himself. So, up until this point, Spain had kind of been France's ally, kind of a weak ally. And so Napoleon starts getting annoyed that they're not doing as much as he thinks they should, and he goes over with the intention to take over Spain. But he tricks the Spanish king and prince to meet with him to say, he was like, oh, I want to settle our disputes. And they go to meet with him, and he makes them prisoners. And he puts his brother, Joseph, as the king of Spain. And he sends all these troops to Madrid, and Spain rebels. And you see a ton of fighting back and forth between the French army and the Spanish people. We can see that here in Francisco Goya's painting, where he shows that day in May where they shoot into the crowds of Spanish civilians, trying to control the population. So Napoleon has a hard time controlling Spain. The Spanish people do not want him there, and they're doing everything that they can to, subvert his rule. Um, They use guerrilla warfare tactics to kind of bomb and retreat different places and attack different like army units. The British see this as an opportunity to weaken Napoleon, and they move an army into Portugal to kind of protect Portugal and aid the Spanish guerrillas. So they're getting, supplies from the British. And it only takes about 5 years, but French troops are expelled from Spain. And this is going to happen right around the same time that Napoleon has his defeat in Russia. Something to note about Napoleon, he doesn't trust a lot of people, but the people he does trust is his family. And you'll see that every time he's taking over a new place, he puts a member of his family in charge of that region. So it's not just his brother Joseph in Spain. It's like almost everywhere he's taking over, he's leaving behind one of his family members to report back. Which brings us to Russia, his greatest defeat. So he tries to invade Russia. He brings with him an army of 614,000 men into Russia. And the Russians' tactic here is just to avoid direct confrontation. They're like, well, we're just going to try and not ever totally meet up with him and his army. And so the nobles and people, as they flee, they all flee into Moscow, which is more central into the country, and they abandon their estates, they burn their crops. So there's nothing for the French army to really gather from them as they're moving into Russia. And this draws the French further and further into Russia as they chase everybody. And it's called scorched earth warfare. But eventually, Napoleon reaches Moscow only to find it kind of burning down too. And he suffers a really big defeat in Leipzig. And he has to return home, but he has lost a bunch of his men by this point because they've starved. They don't have supplies. They couldn't take anything from the Russians. And now it's winter, and they're trying to kind of battle their way out of the Russian winter. So he returns home with only 112,000 men. And this is how Napoleon learns one of history's greatest lessons: you never, ever invade Russia in the winter. And basically, by the time Napoleon gets all the way back to Paris, the Allied forces of the coalition have surrounded Paris. And even working with people from within, they're able to kind of work together to make Napoleon abdicate. And so they force him to sign these documents of abdication, and they exile him to this little island called Elba off the coast of Italy. So you may be wondering, why does he get to go live the rest of his life on this little island off of Italy? Well, it's because the European monarchs that are part of the Allies wanted to restore stability to Europe without turning him into a martyr. They also started to think of him more like a fellow sovereign rather than kind of like a common military dictator. And so they were afraid if they did anything like kill him, they would just be perpetuating that idea that France had already created, that it was okay to kill monarchs. So Napoleon gets sent off to Elba, uh, and he gets, a few things with him. So he can take a small personal guard of 600 men. He gets the title Emperor of Elba, and he gets an annual pension from France. And looking at the pictures of Elba, honestly, like that sounds like a great way to live the rest of my life. So replacing him is going to be the brother of the executed Louis XVI. And these monarchs, the rest of Europe, they mean to restore the Bourbon dynasty by doing this. They want to ensure that peace and stability. So Napoleon's on Elba for about 10 months, and then he escapes. And it leads to this period called the 100 days, where he's kind of on the loose. And the new king, he soon is overthrown. Napoleon returns from exile, and he tries to take power back. And it ultimately ends in the Battle of Waterloo, where the British and Prussian forces defeat Napoleon's army. And this defeat ends the 100 days. And this is Napoleon's last attempt at power. They're fed up with him. They're like, we're not doing this again. So after his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, they sent him to a different island. This one's called St. Helena, and it's off the coast of Africa. You can see it's just like a tiny speck of a place. They literally try to find like the furthest place away from Europe that they possibly can send this man. And that's where he lives for the next 5 or 6 years before he dies in 1821. And it's after the defeat of Napoleon that the Congress of Vienna meets. So basically, all those European leaders, they actually get together, which is a real first kind of for them. They don't usually go meet with each other. They usually send ambassadors, to do that kind of negotiation. But the things that they decide on are that they expand their borders and they shrink France back to what it was, basically like pre French Revolution. And they put the royals back into power where they had been removed. And they do this all in the name of that balance of power, the thing that Europeans have been striving to hold for the last several hundred years. And they also do all of this to ensure stability that curtails those revolutionary ideas. They don't want any of that coming to their countries. So here's the map really at the height of Napoleon's power. So you see dark green is the actual French Empire. The light green are countries under Napoleon's control. The purple are the ones allied with him. And then the orange, which is basically just Great Britain, are the ones that he's kind of enemies with. And then this is the map after the Congress of Vienna. So you see, France gets just basically its original country back. And then we start to see kind of the development of some new situations, like the German Confederation, which will be important moving on. And we get Prussia and Austria kind of getting a lot of its land back. And that really concludes part two of our video about Napoleon and the effects that he had for Europe and the world. For a guy that only ruled for 15 years, he really did some damage. Thanks for watching.